Conrad Nelson Annual Lecture. And this event truly is a highlight of the entire year for our college, and we're very excited to have this wonderful presentation here today. So you are in for something really special tonight. So under the leadership of the Art and Design Department's faculty, we host, usually as part of this event, we host a notable artist who brings to us master classes for the students, a public lecture, and this year it also brings to us a curated exhibition in the Eckert Art Gallery. So make sure that you take a look at that exhibition. It's really special. So as part of that, I would like to thank the director of Eckert Art Gallery, Professor Heidi Leitzke, who really shepherded this event through the process of planning and implementation of it. And she did a wonderful job to bring this event here tonight. So wherever she is, I think she deserves a big round of applause. Here she is. Thank you so much. This event is intended to celebrate creativity and innovation and artistic expression, and it's also intended to show how important these elements are for liberal arts education in this college and in the institution as a whole. It also connects the campus with broader art community. We're very happy to see people here from Lancaster art community and our friends and neighbors from the area. This opportunity would not have been possible without the generous gift of Ms. Conrad Nelson. And every year, as we plan this event, we reconfirm our gratitude to her, as well as other donors who have supported the arts in the college and university. Many, many, many thanks to all of them. And without much further ado, I'd like to introduce now Dr. Leslie Gates, the professor in the Art and Design Department. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm here to introduce this year's Conrad Nelson Fellow. Before I do that, I want to echo what Dean Zacke said about thanking Heidi for her vision and her willingness to bring the artwork of the Conrad Nelson Fellow to campus, so you have an opportunity to not just hear the artists talk about the work, but to see it for yourself. We have a legacy in our department of bringing artists to students, but also taking students to see art and artists, and Heidi has played a big role in that, so I'm thankful for that. I also wanted to mention that if you haven't seen the exhibit, two of the artists were here with us tonight. I believe Mary has already left to drive back, but I believe Michael is here somewhere, but I can't see you. So yeah, can you stand up, please? This is Michael Clemens. He is another artist who has worked in the show in the gallery. Thank you, Michael. Just checking, Mary is gone. Okay, I don't want to miss her if she stayed around. I also want to thank DJ Ramsey in the Dean's office for some of the design work that he contributed to the promotional materials for the event. We're thankful he's part of the team in Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Tonight we welcome Sharif Bey as he gives the 2019 Conrad Nelson Fellowship Lecture. When I first met Sharif, it was in 2016, and we were in a living room at a mutual friend's house following an art education conference. And at that time, he had already completed commissions for the United States embassies in Sudan and in Uganda, and he had shown work all over the world. And he had received a number of prestigious awards, but I didn't know any of that. And as we were hanging out, there was probably lots to talk about: the conference, the craziness of parenting young children, and I left not realizing how prolific Sharif's studio practice was. Once Sharif was on my radar, the ignorance didn't last very long. In the years since initially meeting him, he has finished a fellowship at residency at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. He was the 2017 New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship awardee in the Crafts and Sculpture category. He was the 2018 recipient of the Pollock-Krasner Grant. His work is featured in public collections including the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Renwick Gallery Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Hickory Museum, the Petrucci Family Foundation Collection of African American Art, and for those of you who like to go see art, there's a solo show of Sharif's work next October at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. Bay grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh, and thanks to an article I read about him in American Craft magazine, I learned that Sharif, as a 15-year-old, had Insika and Ceramics Monthly posters all over his bedroom, and he said, quote, "That was my rock band." Bay found his passion for clay during an after-school apprenticeship program at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild in Pittsburgh. He earned a BFA in ceramics from Slippery Rock University. Slippery Rock should sound familiar to you. Slippery Rock and Millersville are two of the 14 universities that make up the Pennsylvania state system of higher education. For the students in the audience, Sharif's story should affirm in you the ways in which institutions like this one provide a foundation upon which you are able to build a meaningful life and career in the arts. Sharif went on to earn an MFA in studio art from the University of North Carolina and a PhD in art education from Penn State University. Dr. Sharif Bay is currently an associate professor of art at Syracuse University. He wants you to note how you can see more of his work and engage with him on social media. Please join me in welcoming the Sears Conrad Nelson Fellow, Sharif Bay.
Good evening, everybody. It is an honor to be here, and this is my first time at Millersville University, and I'm very excited to present once I figure out what I'm going to talk about tonight. I seriously have no idea until I get out here, so I kind of go shoot from the hip. But I've been doing this for a little while, so I feel pretty confident. I think probably one of the most important things to first talk about is my journey. And you know, I'm 45 years old, and I feel like at this stage, I'm not old, I know that. I think I'm an old young person, not a young old person. So I got to figure that out. But at any rate, I think I spend a lot more time looking back these days and reflecting on formative experiences and experiences somewhat related to what you're experiencing now. I've been on that side of the auditorium on many occasions, listening, sometimes more alert, and finding that some things I'm seeing and hearing may not be immediately applicable. And then sometimes it's kind of like, I'm always into Star Wars references, like someone appears like glowing on your shoulder, and it's kind of like, yes, use that brush, you know? And at the time, it's like, what is this guy doing? What is he into? So you never really know where you're going and in that regard and where life is going to take you. If you would have told me when I was an undergrad, based on what I was into 25 years ago, that I was going to get a PhD in art education, there's no way I would have believed you. I couldn't even read a manuscript, much less write one. So anyway, that being said, I want to share a few things about identity because I think they set up an interesting context for understanding my journey. That was a popular 90s word for college admittance essay, so I'm going to use it because I'm kind of from the 90s. But we talked a lot about our journeys when we were applying to college when I was in high school. At any rate, identity is something that I think is significant in that it defines us, in that it defines our values. And this is kind of a sheet that stems from an assignment I do sometimes with my students. And I ask them to define themselves in nouns. And the reason I do that is because nouns are active in a different way than adjectives. I think nouns imply roles, nouns imply values, values imply priorities. So how do these things determine my day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month actions? And I highlight certain things because I feel like some are more pressing than others with regards to what I do from day to day. It's a blessing and a curse, but I happen to be the primary cook in the house. I have 3 children, 2 living at home, 2 teenage boys, and that's my responsibility to figure out what's in the kitchen and what I can make of what's in the kitchen. And it can be an exhausting endeavor, particularly after working in the studio creatively all day. So now I have to go home and create something in a very different kind of studio for a very different kind of audience. So I highlight the ones that affect my day-to-day responsibilities for a reason. I used to start my lecture by talking about where I was when I was 14 in these pivotal experiences I had at a place called the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild in Pittsburgh. And I'm going to talk about that, but over the last couple of years, I started to rethink how I talk about my creative awakenings. And it led me to kind of retrace some of my history for a really important reason. So this is a portrait of my father's family. So it's my grandfather in the middle with my grandmother, and they kind of migrated as part of the Great Migration from Tennessee. My grandfather was born in 1899, and I don't know what horrors they left in Tennessee to come to Pittsburgh in the 20s and start a family, but this is what that family looked like by 1947. They came from a family of 13. I think there's maybe 12 in this picture, and my mother actually came from a family of 12. So between these two families, we actually had 3 different marriages. So these charming guys were courting these beautiful girls from my mom's side of the family. And we have several cousins. But the reason I brought this up is as part of that, my grandfather kind of connected with something called the Garvey movement and later joined an early Islamic, black Islamic movement in the United States. And I think that is relevant to my formative history. And the reason it is because I grew up in what we might call an anti-imperialist household. And that's a really critical thing as a little kid. You hear things, you hear questions about what's happening in our society. And also I grew up in a culture where we're not drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak. And literally we're reading the label, because I was also a pescatarian. So we were literally questioning what was going into our bodies, questioning what was on the news, actively looking for other sources. My grandfather and my uncles were avid listeners of BBC, shortwave radio. So there's an interesting culture of being in a different place. Now, how does that affect me creatively? I'll tell you. And the reason is that it sets up a different perspective on life. And when I say that, I'll say that Christopher Reeves was not my Superman. Elizabeth Taylor was not my Cleopatra. And being taught to kind of push back on that narrative that says white is beautiful, black is ugly, Western influences are the center and the cradle of civilization, and any other sources are wrong or not beautiful or not valid. So what it did is it set up a set of circumstances for me to kind of reach out. And the answers weren't always there. And I like to think that that process of reaching created somewhat of a creative environment. So I'll give another Star Wars reference. And I know that fewer and fewer of this generation have seen the Star Wars movies. But I was not allowed to have white dolls or white action figures in the house. And so that means I had Chewie and I had Yoda and I had Vader. And I had to make up my own story. Without Han, without Luke, what the hell do I have, right? So I had to make something. I had to make something work. And that process of seeking and finding an alternative and recreating narratives resulted in a fruitful, creative upbringing, although I didn't know at the time. So these are works that my dad carved when he was a teenager. And interestingly, we think about art as being associated with pastime, which is associated with leisure, which is associated with privilege. My dad had an amazing start in the arts. I mean, he made these carved wood sculptures when he was 14. And he stopped because he got a job delivering coal to people's houses shortly after his 14th birthday, and never made art again for the next 60 years. And this is kind of the visual culture that stemmed from being a part of this early Muslim movement. And my uncle, who lived across the street, retired a lot earlier than my father because he was so much older. He was born in the early 20s. And he just worked on his house, and he painted murals. He was self-taught. And he did these interesting friezes and, re-arced the doors. And it was like kind of like a palace. I mean, this is it now, years and years later, kind of under restoration, for that to be your living room and to have a pond outside and the koi pond. It's kind of like Mr. Miyagi. I don't know if anybody knows that reference, but my uncle was kind of like Mr. Miyagi. So seeing ongoing murals and architectural structures being built and restored. Another thing happened, my dad's sister, who was married to my mom's brother, sadly, my uncle passed away in a tragic accident in the late 1950s. And my aunt took her 2 sons as a widow and took the insurance money and moved to Cairo for the next 10 years. So there's this really interesting intersection of steelworking African-American community in Pittsburgh and suddenly this kind of interesting remote relationship to Egypt. Not just Arabic language, but the visual culture of Egypt. And let's merge that with the 70s. These were what we would call as a bug out for me as a kid, seeing 70s visual culture by way of my older brothers. My mom and dad had 12 kids too. I don't think I mentioned that. They pretty much had a kid every year between 1957 and 1977. When you have older siblings, you tend to feel more alive and awake and influenced by what's happening. So I can remember watching my brothers and sisters get dressed to go out into the club. So I have a pretty acute memory of that period. And the way I describe it sometimes, it's like Carlos Santana and Bubba Ganoush. It's like George Clinton and hummus. You know, so you have all these interesting cultural mashups. So these are some of the earliest works that I was making as a kid. And again, it was anything but Greek-Roman foundational influences. The same for my dad. I asked him, you know, where did you get the inspiration to make things like this in the 1940s? And my dad said, you know, if the weather was nice, I went fishing. If it was raining or snowing, I was at the Carnegie Museum. And I'm going to pick it up now. So getting back now, so now this is me at 14, bringing all of that with me. And having a wonderful formative art education as a kid and taking advantage of so many amazing programs in the 1980s as a result of the mentorship I received at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild. There's only one thing on here that is a little bit controversial. I don't know if you all know Tim Rollins, KOS, but he actually kicked me out of the program. And I could have actually had a piece as part of a collaboration in the Carnegie International in 1991, but I was too busy chasing girls. And these are some of the things I made in high school. So as part of my education at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, kind of like what you'll see me do tomorrow, and hopefully I'll be as impressive as these guys, but I was a part of kind of an intergenerational, intercultural community of artists to include old lady retirees and hobbyists and art teachers and an amazing visiting artist lecture series with workshops. So this is Paul Soldner on the right and June Kaneko on the left. And these are powerhouse ceramists from the 20th century. And that's me with the red hat. Can't keep my eyes off of them. And I was 15 years old. This is a Philadelphia artist, Sid Carpenter. So we did a collaboration with Sid when I was in high school. This is, I think, 14 high schoolers making this wall piece with Sid. This is David McDonald, who I met during that time, who was a visiting artist. And he and I maintained a relationship ever since. So I've known him for 32 years. This is me firing with David. This is James Watkins, who exhibited in the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild and also conducted a workshop. One of the things that I learned from this time is that I learned what it felt like to be treated with dignity as an artist. So the whole starving artist paradigm, the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, it's a class act, and they brought the jazz trio, and they catered the event, and it was a powerhouse lecture, and they held our student work with the same regard, with the same esteem as they did world-class artists. So we left there with a certain standard of excellence, not just for what we made, but for what we expected and what we put out. This is me as an undergrad student. I went to Slippery Rock University, and I took advantage of every program, just like I did in high school, that college had. And one of the programs was an international exchange at the Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava, Slovakia. At that time, it was the newest country in the world, and everybody but me was terrified to go over there. But there were three things that kept me there for 3 years. I have to say, good beer, beautiful woman, and good soup. So between that and 24-hour studio access, I was there for most of my undergraduate career. And also, I think one of the things that I learned most importantly from this time is I started to work in clay in a very different way, particularly knowing that most of what I made I wasn't going to be able to take home with me. So I started to think about clay as a material that I can think through, that I can use to hash out ideas, to pose questions, to revise and revisit ideas that maybe I presented or attempted to execute with a different tool or in another way. So you'll see a very different sensibility. This is my BFA work. And I look back at these things and I think, I kind of have a different way of articulating what I think I was thinking about at that time. I've been talking to my students now about putting together their dog and pony show in their packet, and it not having to be any deeper than you actually are. I don't know how deep of a kid I was when I was 20, but one thing that I was interested in was interiors. I was interested in form. I was interested in surface. And in many regards, that was enough to merit an assistantship to an MFA program. So I was really genuine about what I was thinking about at the time. And I think about these as vessels for volume. So I'm making this kind of work, and I go home for a period during during summer break, and I hear some commotion outside the door, and I look out. I'm at my mother's. I'm staying in the attic at this time, and I see this kind of police occupation, and it really pushed me into thinking in a very different way about who I was and my agency as an artist and as a teacher. Because I'd been teaching since I was 18 in some capacity, teaching wheel throwing in community centers, working with kids in camps. That was always kind of my side hustle, initially to make a few dollars, and later it became a career. But what is the relationship between what I was doing, what was happening on the streets of my neighborhood is a question that really started to really gnaw at me as a young master's student. And this is actually what I was told when I inquired about this. You can't tell, but that officer isn't 7 foot tall. That's a kid he has in custody. It's a 13-year-old boy who allegedly had some information. And that merited 1, 2, 3, 4, I see 6 cars in the frame. So that, along with gang violence and all the other things that were affecting my community, pushed me to start investing in imagery and asking myself other kinds of questions. And these are just pieces from that era. And when I was during the second year of grad school, I kind of hit what I thought was a brick wall, and I just started making. And this piece has a lot of vestiges of ideas. I should have a clicker. I forgot about this. I like to walk off stage. What this actually did is it pushed me to start thinking about what I was doing in another way. I think it's okay as an artist not to know what the hell you're doing. Sometimes we run in place and we keep in shape, right? Maybe you hit the treadmill instead of going around the block if there's snow. And it's the same way. Sometimes I think it's just important for us to keep something going. So I kind of hit a little bit of a block for maybe the first time in my life. I had a girlfriend I broke up with. I was heartbroken. I didn't know what to do. So I started making these things and letting the dialogue build. This kind of makes me think about this, or maybe it's about this, or maybe it's about that. And I got 2,000 pinch pots into this conversation. And I started breaking them and piling them and throwing them, and they were in my living room, and they were in the studio, they were in the kitchen, and it really it really did something for me. Prior to that, at high school, I was working in a state-of-the-art facility. And next thing you know, I'm like, this was before DVDs. I think it was VHS days. And I'm just putting movies in. I wanted to watch top 100 movies. It was 2000, so the top 100 movies that last 100 years. So I just watched movies and kind of stream of consciousness made these kind of heads that were vessels. And I was hoping that they would start to make sense to me and start to speak to me and help answer why before I can finish a thesis. And I kind of got somewhere approximately, but what happened in this effort is I started to make these pots that were made by hand, made in such a way that I can keep them, conveniently located to me without, in proximity to my body, without any significant facility, and then fire them almost indiscriminately in piles and in various atmospheres. This piece is called Assimilation Destruction, and it's an installation that deals with globalizing identities. And the theory behind this piece, although the museum doesn't really respect my wishes that owns it, but they're supposed to dump this out every time it's exhibited and allow it to kind of dissipate. And the imagery is supposed to ultimately disappear. And of course, you see this mass of pieces, but there's only so much information you can see, right? There's a lot of buried information, and that's also an extension of meaning. So then I got like a teaching job, returning back to the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, and if anybody's old enough to know the Welcome Back Kotter reference, that's kind of how it felt. And we call this expert power in art education, and what I wanted to do or be for my students was everything I wanted in an instructor back then. Up to this point, I stayed at the studio, and I ran in addition to the after-school program, I ran an open studio portfolio development program from 5 to 9. And I made stuff with kids, and that was my thing. It was somewhat selfish, but also reciprocal. And I was working on skill. I don't know if I could show up and start breaking pots and making thousands of pots about identity. It was more about trying to find a way to cultivate not just my energy, but the interest and quest for discovery in young people. And that's what my work was primarily about. My work was about turning on lights in other people, not just necessarily a quest for myself at this point. So these pots are part of the conversation. This is an exhibition at the Smithsonian, and you'll see these pots in dialogue with some of the other things that you'll see me make later in life. And they're an ongoing part of my work. Back then, the pots were much about decoration and historical references than function, but I was trying to, as we call it expert power, I was trying to instill awe and let the kids think that I was awesome. So I wanted to do awesome things so they would want to respect me and follow my lead like I followed the lead of those who inspired me when I was a kid. And I became a dad, and that's awesome. This is one of my favorite pictures. My son is now an annoying teenager, but this was, it was like 10:30, 10:45, and he's trying to stay up so he can be 8. He's 7 and counting down the minutes to when midnight. And then finally he just tapped out. He's like, I'm good, Daddy, just take me up. When I wake up, I'll be 8. And this is just like one of my cutest memories of this particular son. When I was in, my dissertation was interesting about something I already foreshadowed, and it was about I guess it still exists, the social responsibility of Black artists. And when I was in grad school, I was in that kind of crossroad thinking about what does what I do have to do with the condition of people of color in the United States? What responsibility, why do I feel such a responsibility to this bigger question of I versus we? And how does that plague us? And what is the relationship between this bigger individual quest and this bigger collective quest? And it bothered me enough for me to wonder who else was thinking about these things and what other factors determined their trajectories as teachers, as artists, as activists. And I looked at the work of Aaron Douglas and Held Woodruff. So while I was working on my dissertation, I'm trying to be a full-time potter and make these things that I love making. This is the basement of my apartment at Penn State University. They kind of recruited me, saw that I was doing great things at the Craftsman's Guild, and said, you should get a PhD. And it's a longer story as to how that happened, but that was basically it. My brother was on campus, and I was visiting him, and I bumped into some people I knew through the ceramic world, and they introduced me to the director. And literally, the only reason I applied is because I liked the sound of being Dr. Bay. There was no other reason at the time. It's like, you know what? There's no PhDs in my family. That could be awesome. And I had little other information, and it was a great thing. And I was part of a cohort of 20 people from all over the world, all wondering, how can we make the world a better place? What can we do for art education? What's wrong with art education? And the interesting thing about that is I found that I had difficulty getting momentum, trying to write a dissertation, teaching classes. At this point, I had a toddler and a newborn, and it was absolute madness. I felt like I was just trying to keep everything hydrated. I'd spray things and wrap them up and come back to them, get the baby, run upstairs. And I devised a way essentially where I can start to make little things, composite pieces that I can make within 2 to 5 minutes, and be able to, like, expendable things that I can move away from. And this is kind of what upstairs looked like while I'm downstairs trying to, and needless to say, my wife is exhausted in this picture and being trapped in Elmo land, as I call it. So when I started to do that, I found that it became conducive to my household. And I was able to find kind of a niche, a way to create a studio rhythm that jived with the rhythm of my life. And I think that is a really important thing for all of us to have. The landscape is inevitably going to change. The question is, how do we adapt to that landscape, and how do we keep what's important to us central to our pattern? It could be exercise, it can be wellness, it can be meditation, it can be making art, it can be diet. But if it's all an afterthought, it's never going to be sustainable. So how do we find a sustainable solution to live a creative life, to continue to renew our spirits, and essentially renew the spirits of those who are around us? Because if we're happy, people around us have the potential to be happier. So, needless to say, I enlisted the help of my kids to be a part of this culture, to be raised in an environment like I did, where people see things grow, they see things emerge, whether it's an orchid or a meal from scratch or a lump of clay. I think we all deserved that existence. And I mentioned the food reference because that's also a really important aspect of who I am. When you come from a family of 12, you can't get takeout. It's just not affordable for most people. And this is me, again, working these components. And what would happen essentially for us is, it would get overwhelming at times, but by the time I had dozens and dozens of these all over the house, it was like Christmas break. My wife would go with her parents, and to spend Christmas, and I would assemble these things and have a body of work. And it took time to find a way to connect that rhythm and engineer these pieces. But I start to find affinities with other things. So what is made up of components that is the result of the sum of parts? So I started looking at adornment, various kinds of adornment from various historical periods. These are the Mardi Gras Indians, which to me, one of the most amazing traditions in the United States. You have to Google that. I don't think I'll be able to get into it. But the idea that these men are making these large, with sequins and feathers, and sometimes it takes an entire year to make one of these that they only use for one day. And obviously adornment is something that, kind of like these bigger questions I was asking in the beginning, adornment is about distinguishing an individual, but adornment is also about defining a collective. So again, that's an ongoing question that I continue to think about. What is the relationship between who I am and who we are? And I talk about food, and food being a part. To me, food is everything that art is. It's physics, it's interdisciplinary, it's collaborative, it's the relationship between tradition and innovation. It speaks to me on so many levels. It's nature, it's horticulture. So this is, my kids growing up as makers, but different kind of makers. So this is my daughter and I making biscuits. This is my daughter making a pie under my watch. You can see me folding my arms, putting pressure on her. It's my daughter making flatbread. You see all the snow in Syracuse out the window. This is my daughter frying cod. I mean, part of it is somewhat selfish because I need a co-pilot. My wife doesn't cook. So I had to train her to back me up. And even though she doesn't live with us, like she's on shift right now. So, and I think there's an aesthetic education that comes out of not just cooking, but serving, contextualizing when and how and who we eat with. So this is a place setting when the kids were younger that they set. They decide which objects from the house we're going to use to showcase certain foods, to drink from certain vessels, to pour from certain vessels. And I believe strongly that, in terms of my work, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, I think of myself as a sculptor who looks to my formative identity as a potter for inspiration. And I think a lot of times potters look to sculpture for their repertoire of forms, but there's something really important to me about how we relate to functional objects and how we relate to other people through functional objects. And sometimes I think about those things in relationship to how we relate. So a bear hug versus a peck. There are very different sensibilities in how we can acknowledge, our enthusiasm or love for somebody. And, it's kind of like the form follows function thing that people say. So a teacup is different than a pasta bowl, is different than a beer stein. And to me, this particular series of works is also about humility. And I think that's something else that we often downplay when we think about art. We're always talking about art star and a rock star, or, the opposite of that, which is the starving artist. But I kind of tend to appropriate that JFK quote, and I say, ask not what you can do for art, but what art can do for you. So can we find humility in the making as opposed to thinking, look at what I got, So in this case, I often say I'm not trying to upstage the cucumber salad. I'm actually a frame maker. I'm making frames for food. So I'm not trying to make a pot that stands out against this already beautiful sensory experience. This is a series that is of interest to me. It's pots I would have made in the 90s. So this is a pot that I probably tried to make in high school that wasn't so good. And I made it like 4 years ago. And again, sometimes we have an experience and we might write about it 10 years later or 20 years later, and we can think about it and articulate it in a different way from a different point in our life. This is another aspect of me being a functional potter at home and trying to find a way to utilize that identity, not pinch pots that are a lot easier, a lot more expendable. Now I'm exploring making mugs in my living room. And the funny thing about this series is I watch a lot of television while I work, busy work. And some of these series I name after Netflix programs. So these are Narcos mugs. So I watched the entire Narcos series while making as many coffee mugs as I possibly could. And I love, again, speaking of humility, I have, gallery shows in Chelsea and museum exhibitions in Smithsonian. But I also, a couple times a year, I'll just pull out a tent in my front yard and put an A-frame sign in the street. And I love the kinds of dialogues that we have in these kinds of spaces. People bring in their kids, their dogs. Some people think it's a yard sale, and they just pull up. And I love the fact that in these spaces, I'm selling things between $20 and $500. And it's a very different kind of discussion. I'm usually there for 16 hours over 2 days. So I'll do all day Sunday and all day Saturday. This is me working at home. This is the living room. The shipping quilt is my saving grace. I'm able to pretty much contain everything. This is another change of pace. When I was on sabbatical in 2014, I got a residency through the Kohler Plumbing Factory, John Michael Kohler Art Center. And they say it's heaven for workaholics. And it was nothing less. So my proposal involved me moving from making these little intimate pinch pots to me slip casting these things, and utilizing industrial facility to really, really push. The piece in the middle is one of the old school ones that I handmade, and the ones on the right and left are slip cast at the Kohler facility. And this is a motif that I continue to use. There's a piece from this series that is like new as of a couple of months ago, and it's in the gallery here. But I've been using that mold since 2014. Another thing that's really important to me, and for those of you who show up tomorrow for my workshop, you'll see this, is I like playtime. And I think that there's an important performative aspect of teaching that could lend itself to lots of new discoveries. So sometimes I get bored with myself while you're watching me, and it'll push me to try something that I wouldn't otherwise try. So a lot of my it's like this weird self-consciousness. Like, even though you've never seen me do this, I'm tired of you watching me do this because I did it in Kentucky, right? Like, this is really boring. You'll get it. Like, I'm not going to make another teapot. And I'll switch gears and I'll take a chance. A lot of people do like workshop work when they do workshops. They have what they know how to do, and they'll demonstrate the things they know. I think it's important to be vulnerable, and that's how we make discoveries. So both of these pieces, you'll see, this is me at some private school in Kentucky with some high school kids playing around, being silly. And you'll see the two of these result in two very different trajectories. So look at the piece on the left. This is the piece that's on the right. It's me firing at home. My wife looked out the window and she thought I was on fire. She said, what the hell's happening? But these are the kind of things that I'm doing when she's asleep at night. She's wondering. So this is the koi pond, and I converted it into an open pit kiln. We have the option of roasting marshmallows, but this is usually what it's for. And these are some of my influences. Obviously in Kesey, integrating lots of different kinds of materials into a conventional clay form is what I'm all about. A lot of times I reclaim even my own work. So I'll utilize student work. I'll utilize industrial shards from Dollar General, but also fire a lot of nails, carpenter nails, horseshoe nails, blacksmith nails rather, masonry nails. This is one of my pieces. This was one of the pieces you saw me working on in the living room in an earlier slide. This is a piece that you might get a kick out of. When I was a student at Slippery Rock 25 years ago, there was some fear. It was graphics bongs, and they discontinued them or made them illegal to buy in Pennsylvania. You know, I'm talking about bong, right? And everybody bought everybody a bong for Christmas. Like, oh, they're going out of style. So like every coffee table in Slippery Rock had a graphics bong. I guess the circles that I'm running in, but everybody I knew had a bong. And I thought, like, you know, part of my work is about thinking differently about things. And I had this one of the things that led to the necklace pieces. It was a meeting, I had lunch with Don Wright. He's passed away now, but he's like a huge ceramic artist at the time. But he said, I don't make pots. He said, I make sculptures of pots. And I thought, you know, it really, really kind of took me back. And so he's making objects to pay homage to other objects. So I started to expand my repertoire and make sculptures about bracelets, sculptures about necklaces. In this case, this is it's called the Dangerous Bong. So it has all these shards. So it's kind of like a chastity belt for a pothead, you know. So it's like Curb Your Enthusiasm. And this is a piece that is, you know, kind of a mashup of old student work and things that broke of mine and things that I purposely broke. This is an interesting piece to me because of its history. So the centerpiece, this piece is like this big, and this is in the collection of the Carnegie Museum. And the centerpiece was part of a sculpture. And my brothers were drunk and fighting or wrestling, and they knocked it over. And like 2 years ago, I found this in my mother's attic. And I put it on a diamond grinder and integrated it into this larger piece. And the larger piece, the idea came from an image I saw of one of my friends who kind of stuck her head into like a flotation device and took like a selfie. So I bought a flotation device, and I was like, I want to replicate this idea I have in my head. And I'm asking my wife, it's like November, where the hell am I going to find a flotation device in Syracuse? She's like, the internet? So I ordered this flotation device and casted it and made this piece. But I love the idea of being able to kind of excavate my own, it's almost like archaeology of self. Like I find things that I made and like, you know, I've been doing this for a while, like in my uncle's garden, in my mother's attic, in my sister's basement. broken shards of old pots, some sculptures, and I utilize that imagery and incorporate it into new works. So the face of this piece, this is a piece, arguably you could say 1993 to 2018, because the central part of it is from 93. This one, the tip of it, this is in the show. I think the tip of it is from 2011. Everything else is new. And these are fairly newer pieces. This is a series called Kiwi Bird. And these are like this year. This piece I really like. The tip of it is from 2004, and the rest of it I just made. And it's like this big. And again, like I really like the idea of switching gears and switching scale. And like I said, we do that in pottery all the time. We make big punch bowls, we make chargers, but then we make teacups and shot glasses and things of that nature. So you're going from like the robust to the dainty. This piece is owned by the Carnegie Museum. This is inspired by the stirrup vessel and also the jazzman. And of course, West African sculpture. This is a huge piece. It's like this big. It's called Captain's Wheel. This is a newer series. One of these is in the show from the Matriarch Mommy series. It's about, my wife is a nurse and a lactation consultant. And it just seemed like when she was breastfeeding, there was just never enough boobs. It's just like you're switching and it's just like this revolving door of switching and making sure the baby, and then the clock's moving and nobody's sleeping. And I just thought, wouldn't it be awesome if you had eyes on the back of your head and like 7 or 8 boobs instead of just 2? Or I can pitch in if I had some, but hey, I don't have it. All I can do is warm up a bottle. And this is just so you can get an idea of scale. So these ones, I had mixed feelings because they sold, which is bittersweet, but I had just made them, and I didn't get to spend any time with them. So I went home. This is my studio at home, and I'm really excited about it. Dr. Gates mentioned that I received the Pollock Award, the Pollock Krasner Award, to essentially renovate this limestone foundation and turn it into a studio. And I'm just so excited to finally be kind of independent. And it's kind of a playback, like pushing back on my narrative, because my narrative has been about finding a way to make it work. And I can't stop doing that. I still work at home, but it's not as popular as like next to the couch or my office, so, but I eventually have to centralize these things to bring them home. But this is the Mommy series. These are larger necklace pieces. This one is owned by the Smithsonian. Really ambitious piece in scale. And the cool thing about this is I had a show, and it's a nice story. So the bone pieces were all made in Kohler, and I had no idea what I was going to do with them. I just made them. And I didn't know how I was going to configure them. Originally, I conceived them as like a ladder. So they're like dog bones, but it's like a ladder. And growing up as a pescatarian, there was like never any meat in the house. But the only meat that would ever be in the house is like a dog bone. So like sometime in the refrigerator, it'd just be this like dog bone covered in cellophane. And it was such an exotic object to like a non-meat eater. Like, what is this thing? And we had this kind of like meat is exotic to me, because I didn't grow up with meat around. So when I see it, I'm always like, ooh, shit. So these dog bones I made, and they were just in a pile, in a crate. And I moved in 2017, and I had this show at the same time. So I had all these beads. I mean, this is like, talk about a great success story. I had all these beads. It's like they say, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention. It's like, you got a show. You got all these beads. You got to move. What are you going to do with all this shit? It's like, oh, I'll make a piece. And the Smithsonian bought it. It's like pretty awesome. And it was literally like that. I had no idea where I was going with it. I got a residency at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. What would happen if he worked in glass? And the work was a very different pace, frankly, a little annoying. I love her to death, but the technician was very different than me, very organized, very type A, very structured. And I was like, I just want to jam. She's like, wait, we need to have a color meeting and deal with this bullseye glass. I was like, shit, I just want to go. And dealing with wax. So just to give you an idea, this is one level of a kiln in clay on the left. This is a glass kiln to capacity. And this is before the cold working. So needless to say, the rhythms are very different. I love the results, but it's really hard for me to conceive of the time and also the need to solicit other support, because that's something it wasn't, I couldn't be such a lone wolf in glass, and I think that my selfish nature made it difficult for me. But just so you can get an idea of the scale of these pieces, here's some of the glass works. This is a clay and glass. I've made components. I worked with a glass blower, and I designed this. This piece is called a shift tint, so the glass changes color depending on the kind of light. I really like the light reflected on the shadow. So these pieces kind of had this kind of halo-like feel to them that I really responded to. This one's in the show. It has glass components. This is a commission I did for the embassy in Indonesia. It's not glass. This is a Westmoreland Museum. Show you what they look like in my fireplace. So when it's not summertime, I'm not firing in that outside pit. I'm trying to keep the house warm and utilizing that energy to fire at home. This is, to me, an interesting process. One of the pieces from this series is in the show. I learned that I can get a very distinct pattern by wrapping these in high-end toilet paper. You can't use cheap toilet paper, but the texture and the floral patterns that are in the toilet paper transfer onto the form via carbon. This is slowing down. So this is what I'm up to now. And I have 2 museum shows I'm really excited about. And the show at the Carnegie is a really big deal because it's kind of a homecoming. I grew up in that museum. I used to go to the Saturday program as a kid. And I'm now given an opportunity not only to make a body of work, but I'm also working with personnel in both the Museum of Art collection and the Natural History collection to put together, let's say, a dialogue of inspiration and interest and things that have inspired me in both collections over that period. And I'm also doing another show at the Everson Museum. And the Everson Museum has like 40 feet ceilings, and they've charged me with making the lobby lit. So I'm trying to challenge myself to work in that space, and this is the lobby. So these are sections. I'm working totemically in 2 feet sections, and it's a very ambitious project that's demanding a little bit more. Speaking of rhythms, like all these new opportunities are kind of contradicting the culture that has led to my success. So it's like, no, you want a studio here, you want money and a big project. I was like, I just like making lots of things in little spaces, and now I'm kind of having to figure out new rhythms that involve assistance and lifts and levels. And these are another group of sections that are going to be a part of that series of pieces. So I look forward to a fruitful Q&A. I hope I didn't overwhelm you with 125 images, but thank you very much for your kind participation. Yes, for those of you who are not stampeding out, I would like to direct you to either of the 2 microphones to ask questions. I had this happen to me once at University of Kentucky, and it was like it was a Friday afternoon forum, and like a critical mass of students were required to be there. And my niece was one of them, and it was like somebody pulled the fire alarm. And about 400 people left, and there were 6 grads and 6 faculty left in the front row. And that was the Q&A. Sir?
Is this on? Would you talk more about the nail pieces that are influenced by the West African sculpture, the power pieces, I guess?
Absolutely. So something that is of interest to me is, first I'll say from a very simple design design aesthetic. A lot of my earlier work you saw when I'm kind of scarring and carving and sgraffito, I've always been interested in pattern and repetition. And even the necklace forms, it's not a repetition of surface necessarily, it's a repetition of form and positive versus negative space. You see these bird skulls, what they're called, or there's another one that has another motif called peckers or arrows. They're all moving in that way. The nail pieces also are part of that, in that they're what we call a random repetition. So there is, you see the nail piece in the gallery, there's unity in numbers, although it's not like in a regular or an alternate repetition. So that's something that's always attracted me, but also I think the obsessive nature of making a pattern like that has always been, I think I'm obsessed with that aspect of process. So when I did make really simplistic vessels and carve them, I would spend sometimes hours, designing these surfaces. So that's one aspect of it. I'm looking for the gentleman who asked the question. I wanted eye contact, but he walked away. Yes, sir, thank you. Just want to make sure I can address you. But the other is this idea. So in Kisi, sculptures are essentially about when one pierces something, there's two reasons behind it. One is that it is to affirm an oath, or also to signify a testament of endurance. So a lot of times somebody will see these and they'll think it's like violent or torturous, and I don't get that at all from them. I mean, if you get it, that's fine. But to me, it's almost like when we have a conversation, somebody says, "Well, we'll put a pin in it." I guess some people put a nail in it, but it's really saying that we're gonna continue in this journey, or we're going to acknowledge what you've been through. So it does somewhat reference a scar, but I don't necessarily know that all scars are violent either. I think some scars tell really important, valuable stories, and that's valuable to me. So those are the things. See, the way that I think about it is not always like this is what this means, but this is what this makes me think about, and this is why it's generative for me, and this is why it compels me to keep doing it. So that's where I'm at right now with that aspect of the work. Yes, madam.
Can I ask about the clay body that you use? Is it significant where it comes from? Does the color of your work come from the clay body? Or do you use some sort of surface glaze or something like that? Because you showed the one image at the top of your kiln, and they were all stacked on top of each other, but there were varying colors in there. Is that the clay body?
Yeah. So, for the pieces with the nails, and like the piece you see in all the pieces in the gallery for the most part, I use earthenware, and it's a low fire clay, and it's much more forgiving. So if you made a porcelain piece, like Michael's working in porcelain, if I were to put nails in his pieces and fire them that way with that clay, it shrinks too much, and it's way denser. So it's almost like a handshake. You have the wet fish handshake, right? Somebody gives you so the nail's in there, and then somebody shakes, and it's like it firms up as it shrinks and as it fires. Then it becomes like a real deal handshake. But if it were a porcelain, it's almost like it crushes the hand. So it would literally shrink so much that the clay itself would start to crack to the point where it wouldn't be able to stay together. Like, I don't mind the cracks as long as they don't. So the other reason I use earthenware is to be able to account for the shrinkage. And one of the things that I also do is I use a lot of terra sigillata, which is what I color, and the palette is much softer, and the surface is kind of a nice sheen where I can burnish it. Now, when I went to Kohler, I planned on expanding my palette of colors. And that was kind of what the proposal was, is that I would use this vitreous china, which is very dense, and I would integrate more color into my work. And that's exactly what I did. Now, which is interesting to me, that I learned that there's some habits that they're just part of who you are. So even though I wasn't making these things individually like I was at my couch, I was slip casting them in an industrial facility, but I realized that after I made them, I still took each one of them and individually polished it with a unique coating. So I start to cold finish a lot of my work. So now I use pretty much all three clays. I use stoneware, porcelain, and earthenware. So the orange piece in the show is porcelain. The piece with the glass, with the pink glass, it's called hate deflectors, is earthenware and stoneware and glass. So I use a pretty broad range, but I find that the earthenware is most conducive. But I still do a lot of like porcelain slip casting as well.
The nail piece is probably fascinating to everybody, and I was going to ask about that. And Mary said that you actually fired those nails and stuff with it, and then you just talked about that. So then the other shards pieces, are you putting them in and firing them? And so were they like porcelain and earthenware?
Yeah, I mean, because the clay does not shrink, you can use. I mean, like I said, I utilize a lot of old work. Things. There's an old pottery factory that closed down after 100 years in Syracuse, and I reclaim a lot of that work. I buy sometimes plates from Dollar General and break them and integrate them into the work. But because they're already fired, they're not going to shrink at that temperature. But the clay will shrink, but just enough to hold them a little tighter, so it works. And the nails, I learned this from there's a professor from Clarion University, Gary Greenberg, and he was firing a little bit of metal, and even Paul Wandelis at one point, who's in the show, was firing metal. I just kind of took it and ran it off the edge. Like I have some pieces that are like 80% metal.
Could you use stoneware and do that, do you think, or does it,
You could,
shrink too much?
but it would crack. Now, whether or not it would crack apart or how much. See, in some instances, I don't mind the crack as
Yeah.
long as it doesn't compromise the integrity of the form. Like if I impale this thing and it has some tension around it, I don't mind that so much. But you know, one of the things that I started to do, as I showed you from when I was breaking those forms in grad school, as I started to acquire appreciation, you know, for other aspects of the language of ceramics processes that aren't often showcased. Like another one that I mentioned is like when I was a kid, I just remember like being so paranoid about glazing something to the shelf or glazing a lid on. And now I use a lot of glaze in my work as an adhesive. So if I don't want to slip and score. I want these pieces to maintain a certain autonomy, and I want that joint to really be a joint and not something I mush together and slip and score. And I'll just literally use a brush and use glaze as a glue. And you know, it is also nostalgic to kind of think back. Another thing that I would do a lot when I was just starting is we didn't know how to make things, so we make them solid and we cut them with a wire tool, and then hollow them out and put them back together. So adding all of that, you know, kind of more rudimentary, you know, know-how, and sometimes it's kind of like the culture of making do, adding that back into the conversation. Even the pinch pot itself, like I don't really know many people, I don't know if he's still around, but Philadelphia artist Jim Clark, is he still alive? He's not old, is he? Well, I figure I'm getting old, everybody else is getting old, you know? It's like I remember him when I was 15, now I'm 45, this is 30 years later. If he was 60 then, he's probably 90, right? Anyway, Jim Clark was one of the few people I knew who was like in Paulus Bersall, how do you say his name, Paulus? And he just passed away in the Penland area. But but it's kind of seen as like, okay, you got your feet wet, now let's make real clay. Let's make real ceramic art now. Let's move on to coil pots and slab pots. But we always think of the pinch pot as being something that is rudimentary and not really thinking about, you know, the expansive language that can come from that. I mean, I think this is the case about anything. Like when I talk to my students, I say, you know, there's arithmetic and then there's mathematics, right? So we can take these elements and we can go all the way to the satellite with them, right? And that's how it works. But I think we can say that for most of our languages and most of our systems, you know. And that's just one to me that's underexplored. But most steel comfortably fires at earthenware temperatures. That's the short answer. So I'm firing to about 940 degrees, and iron and steel are fine. Like some people even glaze metal in that way. In my case, what happens is the zinc burns off, and it leaves that nice crusty black metal that I really like. But it's actually porous enough at that point where I could actually put glaze on it if I wanted to. Well, that's a whole other question. Having proper ventilation, and oh, she was talking about the smell and the issues. I mean, burning zinc is not something we want to close one nostril and take in, but that's something I can't answer that because I'm lucky that I don't have the issues, but and I never really seen anything like overtly happening, but I haven't been firing a lot of metal in my kiln. Keep them coming, keep them coming.
So at the risk of beating a dead horse, the nail pieces, do those figures have gender? And I don't know your work well enough, but the things that I saw on the postcard and that you showed tonight, I would guess maybe they're male figures. I don't know. The pieces in the gallery seems like a lady, and there's nails in her eyes, and I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. I usually get questions about gender regarding the necklaces, which is not about gender at all, and it's more about transcending gender, because I think of these pieces as being related to deities, and that construct of gender is pretty superficial when it comes to gods, right? But as it pertains to my own work, the one with nails I don't think of. And usually if a piece does have a gender, it's very purposeful. Like there's one piece in there that's about my wife's experience as a lactation consultant and a nursing mother, and I talked about that. But the rest of them, I won't say they're androgynous, but I'll just say that it's not really important to me in that case. Like they're beings, and I'm like, hey, wait a minute, what you got under there? Like I don't, that's like if I were confronted by God, I don't know that I would be that concerned with his parts or her parts or their parts.
So the nails in the eyes?
Yeah, see, to me, and I'm glad you asked about that again, because to me it's also visual language. So there's a symbolic, there's a symbol of that nail and what that nail could mean, right? We hammer things together, we impale things, but then there's like the texture. So I have pieces where I use nails to represent curls. You see that in that figure, there's like eyelids and they represent hair. I've used nails to represent pubic hair. I've used nails to represent beards. So while it has a certain gravity of meaning itself, I also feel it's important for me to be able to use it in my repertoire of images. So I literally have pieces where I use nails to construct a beard. Like in the Deadly Bong piece, like there's a beard of nails. I have nails that represent hair, but then I have nails that are more along the lines of the Nkisi figure, where the nail is. So to me, that also speaks to this kind of science fiction of imagination, where we take something that has precedent in one place, and then we start to think about it in another context, and that's what we call creativity, right? That's how various kinds of music have been birthed. We take something, wait a minute, they're listening to a radio and they have a bad signal and they're emulating it and it becomes bebop, or rock steady, or like these things happen that way. So I feel like I kind of embrace, and I don't necessarily think it's ignorant or opportunist. I think it's just what it is. So it's just me responding and feeling like I can respond to that without feeling that deep responsibility to it. Like we hosted a Chinese exchange student in our home for 2 years, and it was pretty nice that all these new and innovative things, entered into our pantry. To me, I'm like, wow, I'm gonna see what this does. It's not like this must go in noodle bowl, It's like I'm putting this in my omelet with smoked cheese, And as a result of that, you feel like you're at this threshold that no one's ever been in, or that you've never been in. And to me, that excites me. And sometimes, traditions, while they're important and they sustain us for many reasons, traditions also hold us back. So while I feel a responsibility to know what the Nkisi means, I also feel like I should be able to play with nails.
Sorry to go back here, but you mentioned that you use glaze as an adhesive. Is there a certain point in time when you started using glaze or when you stopped using glaze? Because I noticed some of your pieces, they didn't look as like reflective, which is what I'm used to seeing with glaze. So if you could elaborate on that, I really appreciate it.
I don't like glaze, really. And one reason is because maybe I'm lazy, and maybe I'm just a mud person, and I think sometimes we're wired a certain way. Like I'll see a grad student, and they'll come in, and the first thing they do is put a bunch of shelves in their studio and get all Dixie cups and triple beam balances and start testing. I'm just like, screw this. Like I just have no interest in that kind of surface. And I'm interested in these more fundamental surfaces that come from smoke and cold finish. And also I think that one of the challenges I think we have sometimes with glaze is that a lot of times, while some of these vessel-oriented pieces are pretty straightforward, sometimes I make pieces that I haven't really defined where its gravity is, right? So the bottom of my feet may be what's visible. But if I'm not glazing that because that's the bottom, and I have to define that by my surface, it's a little off-putting to me. So I don't use glaze ever in my sculptural work. And even my studio work, a lot of it I'm just like dipping things into communal glazes, or I'll use an atmospheric firing, which is much more satisfying to me, also much more serendipitous and less scientific, which I'm also interested in.
So to achieve color, you say you use like a different type of firing process?
So I'll use stains, and like in the orange piece there, in the gallery, I stained the clay, like literally directly stained the clay before I casted those pieces, and then I smoked those pieces, and then I have pieces where I brush on, like a terra sigillata is kind of like a liquid fine pigment of clay with pigments added to it, and that surface is, to me, it's very subtle and very sleek. And also, this is also getting back to my interest in glass. Like, to me, the biggest part of a three-dimensional object, one of them, is its relationship to light, right? Shadows, reflectivity, and if I want someone, like there's a colleague of mine who I think makes amazing work, but for my taste, I think the forms are so beautiful, and they just have all these drips and just way too much going on. Like, I think his work would be stronger if he just left it white. Because the forms and the shadows and the negative space are satisfying enough to where I don't feel like it needs any more than that. So I tend to invest in much more subtle surfaces. But I do also want subtle variation. Like I don't want it to just be yellow. That's why I like smoke.
Thank you. I like your approach.
Oh, thank you.
You've brought up the fact that you use a lot of reclaimed works that you've done in the past with current works that you do. Whenever you're making, like whatever it may be, do you ever make it in mind, like I'm going to use this for something else in the future, I'm going to break this, or I'm going to use it again later on?
That's a great question too. Like I never make something to break. Like I'll make it with the intent of it being something, and then if I don't like it, I'll stow it away somewhere. And then maybe I'll break it or add something to it. But see, to me, it's all like information. Like at one point after grad school, I was squatting in my cousin's apartment. He owns a lot of properties, and it's like he's boarded this place up. And I got married in 10 years and went by, and I think it's from 97. It's been longer than 10 years. But anyway, I'm dying to get back in his place. I haven't made an appointment with him to get up. I almost want to go in with a crowbar because in my mind, there's just so much information in there. Like, it's like, why do I have to reinvent words if I already have them? And it's so, like, to me, I'm so excited about seeing all of that stuff I left in storage in his place because I'm excited about making new things with it. Like that one installation I showed, it's primarily, it was transported in 6 55-gallon Rubbermaid barrels, and that's how I transport those, and that's how they're stored in the museum. and I forgot like a half a barrel there. I'm like, I can take those and, you know, I had all these faces and all these shards, like I'm dying I can make a whole body of work for just what's left behind. And I love the idea of repurposing things, and also the excitement of not knowing. I mean, when you break something, you know, sometimes I use like tile snips, but for the most part, there's no science to how it's going to break. So to me, it's almost like jazz-like, you know, where I'm kind of playing with that. You know, that unpredictability is conducive to my creative process. So I don't want it to be too contrived. I want it to be something I can kind of, it's like judo. I can just kind of play with the balance of what's happening and move with it. Wait, no, one more? Oh, thank you.
Hi. So I thought it was really interesting that you started talking about how you grew up with a critical eye because of your family and not drinking the Kool-Aid. And I'm currently doing a lot of research on visual culture, and one of the criticisms of implementing it in the classroom is that teachers tend to be too pushy, like exposing their students to oh, you don't have to be this skinny blonde lady to be pretty. Like just saying that to your student doesn't actually make them believe it. It makes them kind of push against that. So what strategies would you encourage for art educators to help their students have that critical eye, but have it through their own discovery and not through the teacher telling them?
Well, I mean, we only have so much influence, and that's one of the challenges, or maybe it's not the challenge, it's just the reality. But I would probably say that, you know, in my case, it's about exposure and also honesty. You know, this might be unrelated, but I had a friend when I was in Slovakia, and he was an absolute mess. And he was the epitome of like the sex, drugs, rock and roll, you know, ginger. All the girls loved him, and he just. And I would go to Slovakia, and I'd spend a semester and come home for a semester and come back a year later. I've been going back and forth for 25 years. Anyway, he developed like a serious addiction to amphetamines and cocaine, and circumstances had it to where he went to. He's in London somehow. I don't remember what happened, but he was down and out with no anything, and the Christians took him in, and he was telling me that. He was like in their house, maniacs, snorting and doing all these crazy things, and they just fed him and did everything they could and lived their life. And slowly over time, he kicked and became like a vegan and became a Krishna and all these things. I just think there was something really powerful about them not judging him and them just kind of modeling what they believed was right. This man deserves food, this man deserves water, this man deserves safety. And I think that sometimes, I remember being in a situation like that at the Craftsman's Guild, where there was these two kids, little girls, well, I guess they were 16, but they were like little girls to me, but they were just making these really shitty little ducks all the time, and they were giggling. No, it's just like, come on. And at the time, like, I was so idealistic as a young art teacher. I wanted everybody to get a BFA. Like, come on, let's get your portfolios together. Like, come on, dude. Like, what are you thinking? And these two girls were like giggling and making little ducks all the time. And when I pushed them, this is a voluntary program. They didn't have to come. And I realized that when I pushed them, they would stop coming. You know, they would come less frequently. And we had like an activities van, and we'd take the kids home. And I realized that this was, I don't know anybody's from the Pittsburgh area, but this was Northview Heights. It's like one of the worst communities in terms of like drug addiction. And I found out one of their mothers is like, she's like turning tricks in the other room. They were there to be safe, you know, and it was an alternative to so many other things. And I had to take back and really think about my role in their life. And they didn't want to be artists. They just wanted to giggle and make ducks. So I let them giggle and make ducks, but I also started to get them to like help me load kilns and help me mix glazes and help me manage certain aspects of the studio that to some kids might be responsibility, but to them, it took more responsibility for them to meet my expectations for what it meant to be somebody who aspired to get a BFA than for them to actually mix glazes and mix clay and help me manage the shop. So I realized at that moment, and it was a really pivotal moment for me, that my job is to create a safe, critical space. And if it's too critical, it's not safe, right? There's some of us who cannot step into a space without feeling challenged. Some of us can be very comfortable with that. It's like, wait a minute, you're Christian. You know, wait a minute, you're gay. You know, and I think that some of us need time to be able to feel like we can enter into that. And when I reflect on my ignorance and my inexperience as a young student and think about the world that art and education has opened up to me, you know, it took a lot of little baby steps for me to get to that point. And I agree with you, period. I think that we need to be patient. That's part of it. And we also have to realize that we can't do it all by ourselves. So that's pretty much all I can offer in response to that.
Thank you.
And thank you all for your wonderful questions.